Welcome to Kitsap Literary Artists and Writers of Washington and its monthly Author and Creative Showcase. I'm your host, Mark Miller. Today I have on the claw hot seat historical fiction author Pat Stricklin. Pat has written a very interesting historical tale under a nom de plume, a pen name, concerning some unusual family secrets in history. So I welcome Pat here to the BCAT studios to examine another local literary work. Thanks for coming, Pat.
I'm delighted to be here.
Well, let's start out. Why did you wind up going with a pen name, and explain the pen name? Because to me it's a little bit different.
Well, growing up, I was very close to my grandmother, and that's who this book is about, my grandmother and my grandfather. My grandmother was an independent, strong-minded, spunky woman who raised 3 children during the Depression. All 21 of her grandkids absolutely idolized her, and I did too. I was very close to her. And she called me Trish.
Oh, okay.
So in honor of my relationship with her and honoring my grandmother, who this story is about, I decided to use the name Trish.
And then the title.
What Lies and Truth.
Yes. How'd that get started?
Right. Even though I knew a lot about my grandmother and I was very close to her, I knew nothing about my grandfather except these little tidbits that she would tell us. She was very close-mouthed about him. She would tell us that he was a Portuguese aristocrat who had fought in the Portuguese coup to restore the king to the throne, and that he had escaped. She told us that he was very handsome, had a beautiful voice, and that my mother was named after his sister. Whenever we would ask grandmother for more information, she would kind of push us aside saying, I can't tell you anymore, it's too dangerous. And so we all accepted that, except for my aunt, their middle child, my Aunt Ernestine, right here.
Okay.
From the time she was 13, through her whole adult life, she felt that my grandmother's stories just didn't match up with reality, that there was a ring of falsehood to them. Later, we found out that the man she said was our grandfather, after my grandmother died, he never existed. So my aunt went in search of the truth. She wrote letters. She even wrote to the Catholic institution where my grandfather actually had belonged, and got information about him. So what she discovered validated her belief for all those years, but it shocked us. My grandfather was a Catholic priest that my grandmother was a housekeeper for a short period of time. And then their relationship continued. And so some of what my grandmother told us was true, but the man she said was our grandfather, a made-up name, who died in 1932 after my uncle was born, never existed. Nothing in the census, no birth records, no marriage records, nothing. He never existed. And through her letter writing and her search, she found out that this Catholic priest was her father, our grandfather. So what lies in truth?
Right. So she never tried to fill anything out other than just the verbal thing. She didn't try to find a name where there might have actually been a record for or anything.
No. We found out after she died, and her closest sister, my Aunt Greta, finally told us the truth. And she said that she chose a last name called Roland, and that had been his mother's maiden name. And so then but she kept his first name. And so when that's the man she said was our grandfather.
Right.
And he just never existed. There's nothing in the records about this man. She told us he was a traveling salesman for a sugar company, which was why he was never around. And this is an explanation to my mother, my aunt, and my uncle. We never met him.
Right.
So, what lies in truth? There were a lot of fabrications, but there were also a lot of truths in it.
So, how did you start writing? Was this your first attempt at writing an actual novel, or did you start writing before?
Well, I taught for quite a few years, and then I was a learning specialist. And as a learning specialist, part of my job was to support the kids and the parents and the teachers with their struggles. And so I would write little plays and little stories that kids could connect to. And so when I retired, I decided I really wanted to maybe become a published author. At first, I wrote a couple of little kid stories, picture book type. Then I wrote 3 middle grade novels and a young adult novel. None of them were published.
Now, where are all these works
That's
of art
right.
at?
That's right. None of them were published. I was waiting until the magic would happen and I would have an agent. But that didn't happen. I might go back to these books and bring them out later. But in the meantime, I began to collect more and more information about my grandparents. And it intrigued me how they kept this secret, because we didn't find out about it until after my grandmother died, and the Catholic Church didn't find out about it either. And so...
About how many years after?
Well, my mother was born in 1928.
Right.
She was their first child. And then the Catholic priest died in 1963, and my grandmother died in 1984. And during that whole time period, my aunt, she would sometimes ask my grandmother more questions. She'd say, well, where are pictures? How come there aren't any pictures? And my grandmother said, well, they were destroyed in a flood. But my grandmother has all these albums of her growing up, and of my mother and my aunt and my uncle growing up. If these pictures with her father were destroyed in the flood, why did all these pictures, why did she have all these pictures?
So that even though technically this is a work of fiction, you managed to also obtain some substantial historical records and some photos that you managed to put together, and of course you've got some here today.
Exactly. And of course I begin with my grandfather, who really did exist. He really was a Catholic priest. We found out when she told us our grandfather was a Portuguese aristocrat, born in 1893. His birth date, that's his birth date.
Right.
And he had a sister named Angelica, and that's who my mother is named after. So these are my grandparents. And then these are my mother, my aunt, and my uncle. The painting was done by a friend of mine, Diane Gardner, who's also a wonderful author. And when she learned about the story, she was kind of sad that there were never any photos of the two of them together. So she decided to take these black and white photos and paint them together. She's an amazing painter, as you can tell.
And then this photo.
Yes, and she also painted this for my sister, and from this black and white photo. So she is an amazing. So these were two things, a photo here, these photos, that helped me create my story. And then I had a few more. After my grandmother died, we found a lot of little hints in her memorabilia that we hadn't seen before. And of course, those were the things that spurred my aunt to look for the truth. So one of the things we found, and it's kind of hard to see, it's a prayer that my grandmother wrote that she dated May 27th, 1927. It had to have been written about the time she realized she was pregnant with my mother, because 7.5 months later, my mother is born. And it talks about her angst about feeling that she could never do the right thing and that she was hoping that she would be forgiven. It says, she says that at times I all but lose it. Dear Jesus, never let that be. Just grant that however discouraged I may be, however sinful I may have been, however far I may have gone from you, just grant that when your grace comes knocking at my heart, I may never, never cry too late.
Because had it come out then, of course, the priest would have lost his position, and of course they could have gotten married then. But let's face it, back in 1927, people weren't exactly very forgiving about stuff like that.
That's exactly right, and that's kind of the focus that I have in my book, What Lies in Truth, this battle that they had between their heart and their conscience, what should we do, and the decisions they made. And so then we also found, for the first time, my mother's birth certificate. There's another story to that. When my mother wanted to get a passport so she could go to Germany, she couldn't find her birth certificate. So my grandmother wrote this affidavit, and I have a copy of it. That's one of the things we found in her memorabilia, saying that my mother was born by a midwife, so there was no birth certificate. But after we learned the truth and started getting a little more savvy, we sent away for a birth certificate in a little different format.
Right.
And this birth certificate, in those days, they had a little box for legitimate. There's a big fat no right there. And then, here's her mother. It's listed, says that she was from Green Bay, Wisconsin, and that she was a stenographer, but there's no father listed. Interestingly enough, I have a birth certificate for my aunt and my uncle. When my aunt is born about a year later, now there is a father, the false father, the fake father that my grandmother managed to make up. So now my aunt is legitimate. And it says that he's a traveling salesman, which is the reason he's never around. And then when my uncle is born in 1932, again, he has a birth certificate that says he's legitimate and has the same fake father.
And of course, the hospital wherever they were born at didn't bother to check,
That's right. They didn't know. And so anyway, these were some facts. Now here's something else. There's with these secret family photos. Actually, down here, this is a photo of my grandfather, and this is my grandmother down in there. It's kind of hard to see. They're playing with some dogs. And this was taken in September of 1928, about 8 months after my mother is born. And I'll talk about her in a minute. So she had just returned from a trip visiting her family without my mother. My mother, and I know that because of the photos that we have of that trip that she took. And on the back of this photo are written the words, "My happy," big question mark, "family." And from my grandmother's friend, who never really learned the truth, that believed these artifacts, these fabrications, she said that they'd had an argument, and that my aunt is born 7 months later. So we think she just told him about that. And then here's my 1931, my mother and my aunt with my grandmother, my mother and my aunt now with the person who was really their father. But no pictures of them together. We know this was taken in Joplin, Montana, 1931, May, by the way. That was written in my mother's photo album. Guess who's born 9 months later?
Who?
My uncle.
Oh, okay.
So we know they were together when that happened. So my uncle is born.
Unless as a priest he had some type of immaculate conception.
There you go. There you go. You got it. No immaculate conception. And then
you have one more thing here.
I have one more thing here, and that is this. My niece who helped me put this together was fascinated by this coincidence.
Yeah.
It's a little crooked there. This is my grandfather when he was ordained in 1923. He was called a family friend.
Right.
He was a family friend, very close family friend, et cetera, et cetera. My grandmother here is about 17, and it's also in 1923, just before they met.
Right.
And she's dressed in these priestly robes, so it just was a strange coincidence.
Well, why would she at 17 be, I guess, dressed in robes like that?
She was always theatrical.
Oh,
and we
okay.
see pictures in her album of her dressed in a variety of things, and I imagine she was in some kind of play.
Okay.
Is what I think. She actually met my grandfather. We learned this from my aunt after she died, and I have it in a letter she wrote to my uncle. They met each other when she became a servant at the abbey where he had taught and where he was
Right.
ordained. So that's how they did. And then when he was assigned to be a pastor to these churches in Montana, he wrote and asked her to be his housekeeper.
Okay.
And then the rest is history. Now here, we're thinking, okay, now what in the world happened to my mother when she's illegitimate?
Right.
And my grandmother shows up 2 weeks after my mother is born back in the little town,
Right.
and there's no baby or anything like that. And she doesn't, when she went back to Wisconsin, she didn't take my mother with her.
Right.
So where was she? She was at the Crittenton home in Helena, which was a home for unwed mothers in that period. And the
Yeah.
interesting about this Crittenton home is that they were much more compassionate than any other home for unwed mothers. They encouraged the women to keep their children, their babies, and they did everything they could to support them so that they could create a life in which they could live together.
Was it religiously based at all?
No, I think they had a religious component, but it wasn't affiliated with a particular
anybody,
church. The Crittenton home still exists in Helena, Montana today.
And still operates?
Not in this building, it burned down, but
Right.
and my sister and I visited there about 6 years ago.
Oh, that's cool.
And they still have a very similar philosophy, but they work with families that are down and out and have issues
Right.
and struggle. And so they're an amazing group. And we believe this picture was taken in 1928. We believe that's my mother.
Oh, okay.
We don't know for sure, but we think, looking at other photos of
Yeah,
her, we think that
good
might be her.
chance.
So anyway, these are some of the,
Well, since this is a real personal and close to home story, has there been any, and since you fictionalized it and wrote the book, has there been any real fallout from it?
not with my family and not with my friends. My uncle, who's 90 years old, still alive, he gave me all kinds of information. He encouraged me to do it. My cousins, my siblings, they all wanted me to do it, and I felt it was a story that deserved to be told, and they've supported me. Now, I did change. I saw a lawyer, a lawyer who deals with literary
Right.
works, and asked about the possibility of what you're thinking.
Yeah.
And so he said that anybody who is not living, that's in your book, if you are sued, they can't win.
Right.
But that doesn't mean they won't sue you.
Right.
So then that would, be a financial issue and other kinds of things. So I changed all the names, even a lot of the places, except for my mother's first name, my aunt's first name, my grandmother's and my uncle's first names. Everything else is changed, except for major towns like Helena and Great Falls.
How long ago was the book originally published?
Actually, in March of this year.
Oh, okay.
So it's quite,
So-
and I haven't had any.
Anybody gotten back to you and said, "How dare you"? You know?
Not yet, though I'm kind of waiting for it. I'm wondering, the Crittenton home knows that I've written this story.
Right.
And they gave me permission to use their name. So I did
Well,
use their name.
hopefully, because that's what they're all about.
That's
Yeah.
right. And I sent them a book, and I just thought that maybe they might ask for more books or something like that
Yeah.
to give to their
Right.
clients, but they haven't. And I send donations to them
Right,
because
right.
I feel like if they hadn't been for them, I
Oh,
wouldn't
yeah,
exist.
yeah.
I wouldn't exist. But anyway, what I had kind of thought might happen hasn't happened. But then I found out the other day that one of their biggest benefactors is the Catholic Church.
Of course.
And so I think that maybe they haven't
bit.
pushed that because
Oh, yeah.
they don't want to offend. And I understand that. I'm not bitter about it at all. I just
Yeah.
totally understand it. So no pushback.
Well, since you went and talked to a lawyer about getting this published,
Right.
how did you arrange your editing? And do you use any type of what I call a AI program? In other words, any of these programs you use, for editing, did you actually use any of those while you were writing?
Well, of course, there's Microsoft, and
Right.
they have the typical spelling and
Right.
punctuation checks, but it's not quite enough for. So I used a program called Pro Writer's Aid,
Oh, okay.
and Pro Writer's Aid does more than just that. It does those things, but it helps with sentence structure,
Right.
word usage, how many times you've used a word, how often you've
Right.
started a sentence in the same kind of way. So there's a lot of structural things they do. And then I got concept edits from two of my writer friends, and then my a couple of my siblings, and that's what I used. So I did use an AI called Pro Writer's Aid.
So how did you wind up publishing it?
I published, Diane Gardner helped me format my book. She's the one that did the painting and who's a great person. She helped me format the book, and it's printed through Drafted Digital,
Right.
and Drafted Digital puts it on Apple Books,
Right.
which are all electronic,
Right.
and then Barnes & Noble has my soft paper copy,
Right.
and also digital, and then it's published through Kindle, direct
Yeah.
publishing, and then you know how that all works.
Yeah.
So those are my.
And do you have any other books or projects in the works right now?
I do. I'm writing a sequel to
Oh, okay.
this,
Cool.
and it's this first book goes up until the time that my grandmother finally does something about the guilt
Yeah.
in her heart, and then this next book I'm titling "The Legacy of Hidden Truth," because the fact that my aunt especially, but my mother and my uncle too, grew up without a father,
Yeah.
and that they knew nothing about their father except for these little tidbits. It affected their lives, but especially my aunt's.
Right.
And she's quite the character.
If somebody out there wanted to contact you, especially for any advice or anything like that with your adventures of writing, how would they get a hold of you?
Well, I have an email, and it's pat@typewritten.org. That's my email. I'm also on Facebook as Trish Mastel Stricklin, and I have a blog, and the blog shares a lot more
Details.
information and detail.
Okay. Well, I greatly appreciate you being here today, and hopefully I'm going to see you at the next CLAW meeting, of course, and some of the events we have out there.
And I am delighted to be here and to share my story.
I'd like to thank all of our viewers for tuning into Bremerton Kitsap Access Television and viewing the Kitsap Literary Artists and Writers Artist Showcase. Of course, none of this would exist without the BCAT staff in the director's booth and on camera. Do you have a subject or activity you would like to showcase on BCAT? You can contact the manager, Colleen Miko, and pick your brain as to how you want to fulfill your dreams. BCAT exists to support the residents of Kitsap County. This program will be broadcast Saturdays at 6 p.m. on Astound at Wave Cable Channel 3 and also on Comcast Channel 12. You can also watch it on live stream at www.bcat.com at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Keep in touch with CLAW on social media for upcoming events. Kitsap Literary Artists and Writers meets the first and third Wednesdays of every month at Spiro's Pizza on Kitsap Way in Bremerton, Washington. Usually the official meeting's at 7, but I'm usually there earlier, especially when it's during the darker months. On the second Tuesday of each month at 7 p.m., there is a companion group, Kitsap Peninsula Filmmakers Group, meeting at the Family and Pancake House on Wheaton Way in Bremerton. CLAW exists to help all artists and writers to create, publish, and market their works. All creatives are welcome at the meetings. CLAW and affiliated residents have some upcoming events. You can check out our Facebook and Meetup pages to follow us, as well as our new web page at https://www.claw.group. Works from CLAW members are also listed and linked on this site. By the way, Blue Forge Group, the umbrella nonprofit organization, has ensured CLAW episodes are filmed over the last 3 years or on YouTube. Query CLAW, Blue Forge Group, or my publisher, Blue Forge Press, and you can locate recordings and artistic works of your favorite authors and creatives. And of course, watch for our famous Halloween and Christmas shows. I hope all the viewers have a pleasant and very productive year and a pleasant evening and an even more productive week. Remember, keep reading, writing, and filming. Until next Saturday, this is Mark Miller with Kitsap Literary Artists and Writers at the Bremerton Kitsap Access Television Studios, signing off. Good day.